Close your eyes. Now imagine the cold wind slicing through soaked wool. Your hands are blistered from rowing for hours. The sea sprays salt into your face with every crashing wave. You haven't eaten a hot meal in days, and the sky, grey, heavy, endless, offers no sense of direction. This is not a story of conquest. Not yet. This is a story of survival. Long before the Vikings became known for raids and treasure, they were sailors. And those first voyages across unknown waters were brutal. Far more brutal than most people realize. Their ships were open to the elements. No shelter, no warmth. Just rows of men, shoulder to shoulder, trying to cross freezing oceans in shallow wooden boats. They didn't have compasses, no maps, no clocks. They followed stars when they could see them. They watched birds. They memorized wave patterns. And they often guessed. Food ran out. Water spoiled. Some froze. Others starved. Many never returned in this video. We'll take you inside the overlooked world of Viking seamanship. Not the glory, but the struggle. You'll learn how their ships worked, what they ate, how they found their way, and how they faced the endless dangers of the open sea, from shipwrecks in the North Atlantic to silent breakdowns in crew morale. We'll explore the lesser-known truth behind their legendary journeys. Each chapter will uncover a new layer of hardship, physical, mental, and even emotional. And by the end, you'll see Viking sailors not just as warriors, but as survivors of one of history's harshest tests. So, if you've ever wondered what life was really like out there, far from land, far from safety, stay with us. Welcome to The Restless Historian. Subscribe for more calm, curious stories from the darker edges of history. Close your eyes and imagine a wooden boat carving through cold grey waves. The deck dips and rises, slick with sea spray. That boat is a or sometimes a nair. Both were built to brave the oceans, but they were still narrow, cramped, and unforgiving at first glance. A longship looks almost elegant long, narrow light. The hull uses a technique called clinker built. Thin oak planks overlap and flex. This makes the ship strong, but there is no comfort. The sides are barely a meter high. No cabins, no walls, just open sky and the sea. Longships had both sail and oars. A single mast held a square sail 35 to 40 feet wide. When the wind died, the crew rowed. Up to 60 men sat on sea chests. They rowed in to shifts about 4 hours on, 4 hours off. During good weather, the sail could push the ship fast up to 10 knots. In close quarters or storms, rowing was necessary. The oars were long 15 to 25 feet. Without rowlocks, they rested in holes below the gunwale. These holes were covered from inside with wooden discs to keep out water. Sometimes a nar was used instead of a cargo ship, broader, deeper, and shorter than a longship. It held more cargo, needed fewer crew members, often 6 to 15 people. It still used oak planks and clinker design, but it had a raised deck and more freeboard. On a war longship, the crew could reach 60, split into 2 watches of 30 each. Each person could row, but also had secondary tasks. Life aboard was a mix of rowing, hauling sails, standing lookout, patching leaks, pumping water, and general maintenance. Crew structure and roles: a warship carried about 60 men. 6 roles existed, but everyone was expected to switch between them. At the bow stood the lookouts and rope handlers. They managed the anchor, handled the 4 braces, and reefed the sail when needed. Below them, in the midship, Men tightened shrouds, baled water, manned pumps, and relayed orders. At the stern, a smaller team handled steering, navigation, and sail control. Even the cook had a place there. When sailing, roughly 10 men were enough to handle the sail in moderate winds. But rowers were needed for speed, maneuvering, or when the wind dropped. This is why backups were essential. You could be rowing for hours with no rest. If men grew tired, they would swap with others returning from the watch. On nabbers, the crew was much smaller, between 6 and 15. These boats relied more on the sail. They carried cargo, not warriors. Even so, rough seas demanded all hands for maintenance and pumping. Constant rowing, endless vigilance, rowing was brutally punishing. Rowers sat cramped on sea chests. They faced the same drop of water with every pull. Their rowing pace could reach 6 knots in short bursts. But that pace shattered limbs. Fatigue came swiftly. That made the row shifts painful. Stillness never lasted. Even when not rowing, crewmen handled sails. They reefed, trimmed, or lowered the sail quickly when storms appeared. Steering with a single rudder oar demanded constant movement. When at sea, there was no turning off the ship's rhythm. Maintenance always demanded the ship was alive. It leaked, ropes chafed, sails tore, tar weakened under sun and salt. Maintenance was its own relentless task. Every rope needed care. Crew climbed on stays, scrubbed them, retarred them with pine or coal tar. Tar hardened in cold, bled in heat. They had to reapply often every 6 months or more at sea. Rigging needed tight tension, but wet rope stretched. Dry rope contracted. Crew had to constantly retune the shrouds. A loose rope could snap under pressure. Wood too needed attention. Planks flexed. Iron rivets held them together, but joints could leak. Between planks they packed moss, wool, or hair soaked in tar to waterproof. Even so, cracks and leaks appeared. Pumping and caulking were daily chores. Living in the open air, no cabins. No privacy, the ship was exposed. Rain, spray, wind, everything hit the crew. They slept on deck, sometimes inside a makeshift shelter. Blankets and cloaks offered little warmth. On Nar's raised decks offered small protection, but they were still open. Men huddled in the wind, fought sea cold at night. Wet clothes never dried. Frostbite and blisters were common. Food was basic dried fish, salted meat, hard biscuits. Water sat in wooden barrels. Salt air spoiled it fast. Men drank when they could. Thirst followed hunger. But chores never paused. Repairs and rowing had to go on. Hierarchy and discipline order was critical. Chaos at sea was deadly. The captain gave simple commands: row, reef sail, lower mast. The crew obeyed. Mistakes meant damage or death. A Nar crew was smaller. Everyone had to multitask: row, repair, steer, balk ice. No slack. A watch system was in place. For hours on duty, for hours off. Even rest was cramped. On tight decks, 3 men could share 5 feet, sitting shoulder to shoulder. Hierarchy still applied on Nares. A master, navigator, bosun, carpenter, cookage had duties, but everyone helped with rowing or pumping. When storm hit, the bosun could order everyone on deck to fix rigging or bail water. Nar versus longship. Similar hardship, different purpose. Longship. Narrow, fast, made for raids and passage. Crews of 60. Open deck, maximum speed, minimum comfort. Nar. Broader, deeper, slower. Crew 6 to 15. Good for trade, but still open to the sea. Deck maintenance, charting, steering, a small crew did it all. Both faced the same sky. Both awoke to wind and waves. Both had the same tasks: row, repair, pump, cook, sleep. Repeat through those endless drips, shifts, and rigging chores. The ship and crew formed a single unit. No comfort beyond purpose, no rest beyond survival. That is life on deck. The wind tore across the open sea. Not a warm breeze, but a screaming blast of frozen air. Out here, far from any land, the cold didn't just bite, it punished. Temperatures could drop to -30°C. That kind of cold crept into the bones, settled behind the eyes, and stayed there. Even breath turned painful. Vapor froze on beards and lashes. Every surface, the sail, the deck, the ropes coated with a thin skin of ice. Salt water made it worse. Waves rose and smashed against the ship, sending icy spray high into the air. When it landed, it froze instantly. The ship became a floating block of ice. Ropes stiffened, tar cracked, and every footstep on deck risked a fall, and there was nowhere else to go. Viking ships were open. No cabin, no shelter. If the storm came, you faced it, or you didn't survive it. Storms on the North Atlantic were not rare. They were constant threats. And they weren't storms in the distant sense. They were walls of wind and water, sudden and violent. You might see a few clouds building on the horizon. An hour later, the sky would blacken. Wind would whip the sea into mountains. The longship would rise on one wave and plunge into the next. Rain turned into sleet, then snow, all of it sideways, all of it sharp. Rowers struggled to hold their oars in place. Every movement burned. If their grip loosened, the oar could be torn away. If it struck another man, that was one less set of hands to help. Many had to chip the ice off their oars before they could even use them. Sail handlers climbed slippery rigging, their fingers numb, their feet frozen into soaked boots. A missed knot or tangled line could doom the entire ship, and no one came to rescue them. No one even knew where they were. Modern replicas of Viking ships have tried to make the same journey. Some have capsized. One recent replica flipped when hit by a sudden wave. 5 survived, 1 died. It wasn't because of a design flaw. The ship was built like the old ones. It was the sea that showed no mercy. Even on calm days, the cold never let up. The clothes Viking sailors wore were wool, leather, or animal skin. But after hours of rowing through freezing spray, everything got soaked. There was no fire on board, no chance to dry anything. Clothes froze while being worn. They became stiff, heavy armor, dragging the body down. Men tried to keep moving, not just to work, but to stay warm. If they stopped, their joints would lock. Fingers would blacken. Skin would split and bleed. Frostbite was not a distant medical condition. It was immediate. Ears, noses, toes, fingers, they turned pale, then grey, then blue. Pain came first, then numbness, then a deep ache that meant something inside was dying. There were no doctors. On board, no bandages. If the damage was bad, the hand or foot was lost. Amputation was rare, but not unknown. Some tried to build makeshift windbreaks on deck, blankets tied to shields, or bits of sail stretched overhead. But in a storm, those were torn away. The wind would find every inch of skin. It didn't matter if you were a warrior, a farmer, or the ship's leader. Out here, the cold treated everyone the same. Exhaustion set in fast. Men worked long shifts, for hours on, for hours off. But even off-duty time was no real rest. The deck was too cold to sleep. Bodies shook from the cold, and the constant rocking of the ship made it impossible to get warm. Some curled up in wet blankets. Some just sat still, conserving their breath. No one dared to sleep too deeply. A sudden wave might toss them across the deck, or overboard. Food helped, but only slightly. Rations were hard and dry. Salted meat, dried fish, hard bread. Eating cold food with cold hands while your body trembled wasn't comfort. It was just enough to keep going. Drinking water was often tainted by salt spray. Barrels froze. Snow could be melted on warmer days, but mostly, they drank as little as they could. Dehydration came silently, under layers of cold. Worse than the cold was the silence between storms. When the wind died and the ice settled, the air felt even heavier. The sea was flat and black. Men sat quiet, too tired to speak. No laughter, no singing, just breathing. The fear didn't come from what they could see, it came from what might come next. Every hour could bring another squall, or pack ice, or a drift hidden just beneath the waves. Icebergs weren't towering mountains. They were often low, jagged, and deadly. A wooden hull didn't stand a chance. Some voyages lasted weeks, others months. Those who sailed into the northern waters toward Iceland or Greenland knew what to expect. But that didn't make it easier. Even experienced crews lost men. One wrong move, one sudden wave, one drop too much ice on the sail, and the ship could flip. In freezing water, survival time was measured in minutes. The sea didn't care about bravery. It didn't care about skill. It punished slowly, and then all at once. A sudden blast of wind, a sharp shift in temperature, and the strongest among them could go from working to unconscious in an hour. Hypothermia didn't look like panic. It looked like someone sitting too still, their eyes unfocused, their breath shallow. By the time anyone noticed, it was too late. There were no rewards for surviving the cold, only the chance to face it again the next day. There were no songs about holding your breath while your boots froze to the deck. No stories about waking up with your hands stuck to an iced rope. And yet, that was the reality. This wasn't the heroic Viking Age, as told in myths. It was the brutal, cold truth of the sea. A place where ice didn't just float beside you. It clung to your ship, your hands, and your lungs. A place where storms didn't just pass, they shattered. And somehow, in the middle of all that, the sailors kept moving. Not because they were fearless, but because stopping meant dying. And so they rowed. Day after day, frost on their faces, soaked to the bone. Steering their fragile wooden world through a sea that offered nothing, except another storm. Salted fish and dried meat were the backbone of Viking voyages. Fresh food simply would not last at sea. Cod, herring, and halibut were caught along the coast, then cured with salt and air, dried into hard slabs. Grain, beans, root vegetables, and occasional dairy added a small variety. But once at sea, survival hinged on thick blocks of preserved protein. Salt drew moisture from fish and meat. It killed bacteria that would otherwise spoil the food. These slabs could last for months without refrigeration. But salt preservation changed the meal. Sailors spoke of pork so salty it burned their lips and made water taste sweet by comparison. To eat it, they soaked the meat in water first or waited for it to soften in stew. Dried fish, known as stockfish, offered a lighter alternative. Wind dried on wooden racks. It hardened into dense, chewy blocks. Men had to soak or beat it before cooking. Once softened in hot liquid, it turned into stew. Such stews sometimes included peas, beans, or barley if these had not spoiled. Even with these methods, food on long journeys could go bad. Bulk barrels stored salt or pickled vegetables. Some fermented whey to preserve meat, but fresh water washed out into the sea. Barrels mixed with vinegar could last 2 weeks, but only just. After that, water became sour, slimy, or even poisoned. The crew rationed carefully. Drinking was done sparingly. Thirst and hunger competed at every meal. Some voyages went badly. From the start, food rotted before reaching sea. Meat barrels sprung leaks. Dried fish hung on faramina became infested with beetles or weevils. Men ate larvae if no options remained. Even bread-hard biscuits when damp became crawling with insects. Scurvy crept in. Weak limbs and bleeding gums came with lack of vitamin C. Some crews tried pickled vegetables, but these rarely lasted past the first weeks. Scurvy still struck hard. Fishing at sea offered some relief, but not always. In calm weather, sailors cast nets into the dark water. Any catch was prized, but fishing slowed rowing. It took time to bait, haul, clean, cook. One man worked the cook's cauldron in the stern. 7 or 8 men were grouped as a mess. An orderly fetched and served lessons, but officers ate first. Ordinary men waited. If they were starving, even that meant nothing. The cook's role balanced on a knife's edge. He kept the fire burning, boiled stews, distributed salted meat, and scraped fish. He also monitored water use. Freshwater barrels sat in the hold, tumbling with the ship. Manners of taste faded quickly. Men drank less, so salt meat stayed edible. They spilled less, but they still ended up thirsty. Cooking happened on a small hearth or stove. Heat was lowered, on deck was scarce. Sparks on a wooden ship meant fire. So meals were simple. Softened stockfish, salty pork, maybe boiled barley or peas. Good days meant some foraged seaweed or root scraps if they passed islands. Wild food was rare at sea. During storms, cooking often stopped. Water flooded the deck. Men abandoned the cauldron to bail. Food went cold or was thrown overboard. Wet conditions spoiled any attempts at making stew. So many long hours passed with empty bellies and cold bones. Time passed slowly. On calm days, the crew counted days by rations. 1 slab of stockfish, 1 spoon of salted meat, a handful of grain. Hunger gnawed. Men spoke less. Their hands trembled. They dipped meat in water, soaked bread, tried to soften food with tears or raindrops. Moisture helped, but never enough. Some voyages ended before discovery. Ships turned back when cabins emptied. Nothing worse than turning around with your sail torn and your crew dying. And yet, more than tales of heroism, Viking sagas occasionally mention voyages aborted due to lack of food and water. Starvation was more common than glory. Water, especially, defined survival. Freshwater barrels were sealed tight when leaving port. Mixed with vinegar, they stayed drinkable for a fortnight. After that, water turned sour. Men strained it, boiled. It filtered it, if they could. Rainwater was collected in sails or barrels. But in the cold sea, rain was rare. The sky could stay grey and dry. Salt water was poison. A single sip invited cramps, sickness, and dehydration. Men knew better, but in the grip of thirst, rules slipped. Some fell ill. Dysentery followed. Death came swiftly in those who drank what the sea offered. Yet some men survived months on preserved food and stale water. They rationed, convinced themselves it was enough. They waited for land, and sometimes they found it. Islands that offered fresh water from streams. Rivers they followed inland. There they could eat fresh food again. The contrast was sharp fresh barley, porridge, roasted meat, berries, greens. Their bodies remembered hunger afterward, but many did not reach that point. Crews were smaller. Men fell ill, grew weak, could not row. They were buried at sea or left behind when they reached land. Their names survived rarely in the sagas. Only the ship's name lived on. On better voyages, the preserved blocks lasted through storms and cold. Stockfish remained edible for more than one season if kept dry. Salt meat lasted through weeks of sea. Vegetables might have fermented into edible brine. Cheese and skyer lasted longer, but nothing was reliable. Food and water ruled the voyage. They defined how far a longship could go. They dictated when it had to turn back. They tested the crew's discipline. Too much food wasted, and they starved at sea. Too little, and hunger broke morale. Too much water drunk early, and they died parched. Too little, and they lost strength in storms. The struggle for food echoed in the rhythm of rowing. Every day, the crew needed enough energy to paddle, enough fuel to stay warm, enough water to stay alive. They pushed heavy oars, hauling salty meat in their bellies. They trimmed sails on empty stomachs. The Viking Voyages were more than warriors and explorers. They were survivors. They measured success not in treasure or land, but by the grip on hunger. Each preserved slab represented hope. Each sip of water meant another day. Each plan to resupply kept them rowing. In that world, food and water were the most feared enemy. Glassy waves hid it. Salt air wasted it. Storms spilled it. Ships returned not with glory, but with empty barrels and broken bodies thankful to drink from a river again. Viking sailors did not carry modern compasses. They trusted their minds and the elements. They observed the sun, stars, waves, and wind. They built routes with pictures in their heads. Every voyage required memory, sights, and know-how. During daylight, sailors watched the sun's path across the sky. They could use a simple wooden board with a stick to track shadows. It helped them know their latitude. Some crews may have used sunstone's transparent crystals that revealed the sun's position in cloudy skies. These techniques gave them bearings. Without metal tools. At night, when clouds cleared, star navigation took over. Polaris, known today as the North Star, helped them hold course. Celestial navigation worked, but only when skies were clear. Cloudy nights, fog, or storms erased the stars. Sailing then felt like walking blind. Most navigation was coastal. Crews memorized landmarks, rock formations, distinct hills, burial mounds, islands with weird shapes. Some places even had fires or crosses carved to help guide sailors. These landmarks acted as waypoints along shifting coasts. Sailors learned them by heart before long voyages, but open water was different. In the North Atlantic, landmarks vanished. Crews used seabirds, whales, currents, and cloud formations. Flocks of coastal birds signaled land nearby. Whales swam near currents, favoring nutrient-rich coastal waters. Ancient sailors smelled sea breezes that smelled faintly of fresh land. Currents told stories. A sailor placing his face in the wind could sense subtle shifts in texture and direction. He could hear waves breaking on hidden shoals. He could taste tiny differences in salt and fresh water mixing. All these senses combined into what they called sense navigation. Memorizing invisible currents and wave patterns took time. Mariners repeated voyages, often with the same leaders. They spoke of mental charts. They passed down information by voice, rhymes, chants, stories tied to places and currents. A navigator might sing a verse about erring west of a snowy hill, then south of two islands, and sailors would know where to steer. Cramped decks made navigation tense. Sailors shared tiny sea chests as seats and storage. There was no space to stretch. Night watches meant sitting close together in damp cold. Standing on deck, keeping watch for stars, land, or birds made mental focus critical. Each small clue mattered. Missing a landmark or misreading a current could send them hundreds of miles further from home. Mental fatigue set in fast. Fatigue built slowly, one foggy night, another clouded morning. As hours built into days, focus slipped. A tired sailor might miss a bird, confuse a current, or forget a star position. Direction became uncertain. Conversations slowed. Iced glazed. Some men sat, staring at water, unsure of where they were. The sagas speak of sailors becoming half villa, bewildered at sea. Their minds went blank. They couldn't say east from west. Anxiety rose on the deck. Men looked at each other, fear in their eyes. They spoke only in low voices. Many ships turned back rather than risk being lost. Memory failed under strain. Navigators used tricks. They counted days since the last known landmark. They kept logs in their heads, 5 sunrises since land. They watched sun angles at midday. They remembered where on the horizon the sun set last night. A degree off meant miles off. They adjusted constantly. Weather made navigation a nightmare. Dense fog masked sea and sky. Storms erased horizon. Heavy rain washed away scents and cloud patterns. Waves became their world. They steered by feel, waiting for a break. Every direction sounded the same. Long hours of guarding the helm taxed bodies and minds. Some picks for night watchers called out every few minutes. Star there, star gone. Others measured wind changes on the skin. Keeping even quiet awareness was exhausting. No rest light could reset their minds. Their bodies continued rowing, pumping, repairing. Their minds barely paused. In tight spaces below deck, no one truly rested. The teeming, shifting, crushing pressure of the water outside pressed on the wood. Teammates breathing, rattling crates, dripping leaks all added to the tension. Even asleep, ears stayed alert for unfamiliar creaks, groans, or sudden shifts that meant trouble. When land appeared, relief washed over crews. But navigating toward it took nerve. Mistaking one hill for another could strand the ship on reefs. Hours later, some voyagers saw the coast for days before they dared to navigate toward it. Once sighted, land still needed careful arrival. Sailors used currents and small landmarks to guide their approach. Even then, they avoided hidden shoals or fast tides. Boats launched with scouts first. They sounded depths. They tested anchor holds. Only then men prepared to step onto land. When voyages succeeded, sailors praised navigation skills. When they failed, they blamed the sea. But the sea only revealed what men could or could not remember. In the emptiness of open water, with no compass, no map, and no modern tools, navigation became mental endurance. Sailors learned what we forget. The mind matters most. Fatigue kills focus. Feeling for currents, listening to water, smelling coasts, watching sky, remembering stories and rhythms, all became tools. All were needed to survive. Wood cracks, ropes fray, masts fail. At sea, nothing stays sound for long. Every wave bends the hull. Every gust strains the rigging. Viking sailors knew this. Well, repairs began as soon as damage appeared, or else their ship would become their coffin. One replica Viking ship, the Sea Stallion, once sailed more than 2,400 sea miles from Denmark to Ireland. On that long voyage, planks cracked along the hull near the mast step. Water seeped in, and the crew had to return to port and haul out the ship to fix it. This crack didn't just happen once. It opened again even after repelled. Wood flexing in the sea wears out fast. Viking ships lasted only 20 to 40 years before being scuttled or replaced. Masts were under constant pressure. The wind tore at sails, and waves tilted the ship back and forth. Compression force built in the mast base until it faltered. Without warning, the mast could snap or shroud fastenings could fail. In traditional sailing ships, this is called a mast could fall in seconds and smash through the deck. Sailors had no workshop. All repairs were urgent, on deck, near chaos. If the mast broke, men tied up halyards and shrouds to stabilize whatever remained. They lashed it with ropes. They used spare spars as jury-rigged masts. They climbed on wooden staging to secure temporary support. A broken mast didn't stop them. It forced them to act quickly while wind and water attacked. Snapped ropes were constant trouble. Ropes rubbed on rigging or sail edges. Tar-dried and cracked rope fibers, waves soaked and stretched lines. Without good rigging, masts fell and the ship lost control. Crews checked lines often. When a rope frayed, they spliced it in twisting fibers, inserting a fresh section and binding it with tar-treated lashings. They carried extra rope along for this reason. Sometimes they nailed temporary patches onto the hull. Caulking faded. Tar and moss sealing seams wore thin. Water seeped between planks. Sailors had to plug small leaks mid-voyage. They carried moss, wool, or animal hair. They packed it into seams and covered it with tar. Higher pressures from waves often broke the plugs, so they repeated it daily. On Sea Stallion, during a long trip in rough seas, fasteners around mast area loosened. Nails popped. Iron spikes backed out. Crew pounded them tight again. Leaks opened and closed with the tide. Every maintenance task could become dangerous working at sea on a rolling deck. They used basic tools, wooden wedges, mallets, knives, saws. If they carried spare planks, they could replace cracked boards, but taking off a damaged plank, trimming a new one, fitting it tight was slow and wet work. Ship edges dipped into ocean spray. The bilge filled. Without dry space, repair work took hours longer and risked injury. Far from harbor, the danger increased. If a mast broke in mid-Atlantic, the jury rig might barely hold. They lost speed. Storms could come. Ropes might snap during repair. In heavy sea, working alone on mast shrouds or hull breaches meant falling overboard could end your voyage and your life. These long repairs sacrificed progress. Voyages slowed dramatically after damage. Once masts broke, a nair or longship might drift for days. Rations dwindled, morale dropped. Some voyagers turned back, others limped on, praying for land. It was rare to press forward with full speed again, despite constant danger. Sunken ships tell us Vikings expected damage. They built redundancy into design. Spare rope, extra fasteners, craftsmen skilled at sea mending. Anyone could splice a rope or plug a hole seam. The difference between returning home and sinking depended on who could do it best. Fastest dot would restoration mid-sea was delicate. They had no kill, no steam tools. They worked by feel. A loose spruce plank was scraped smooth and then replaced. By tight-fitting oak, the patch had to sit flush to the waterline. Even a small gap allowed water to rush in, filling the bilge faster than a man could bail. In Viking crews, a carpenter or shipwright was prized. Everyone could row, everyone could bail water, but only a few could splice ropes at height or restep halyards. They climbed up shrouds to inspect the mast cap. They used mallets to reseat tightened planks. In storms, these men could save a ship. They worked under pelting rain and freezing spray. The emotional toll was heavy. Every snap or crack was a jolt of fear. Even repairing took intense focus. One slip while sawing a plank near an open seam could let water in unnoticed. Every nail hammered in wrong could punch through the inside. Mistakes meant more pumping or disaster. As the ship aged, fatigue set in. Fasteners loosened more often. Ropes frayed faster. Planks dried and cracked under changing temperatures. Even spoils of craftsmanship fell short of modern standards. Baseline maintenance turned into emergency. Repairs. The crew learned to live in fix-it mode, always half-fighting the ship itself. Ship damage followed them like a shadow. Storms could strip off yardarms. Ropes snapped under heavy sails. A rogue wave could crush a section of hull, twist the keel. Every voyage risked turning into a struggle against your own ship. And yet, in long sagas of Viking exploration, voyagers succeeded. They found new lands, traded, returned with wealth. The difference was skill. Fixing your mast in the open sea meant you could survive the next storm. Plugging a leak before bilge pumps failed kept you afloat. Mending ropes under pressure kept sails upright. They treated their ships as living beings. Ships moved and breathed. They had to be kept healthy. Every repair was part of that. Harbors were safe places, but so rare. Most voyages happened in empty oceans. Repairs had to be reliable. Crews trained for it. Every man could row, and many could repair. It wasn't about starting strong, it was about finishing stronger. Fixing ship damage on the open sea was 50% skill, 50% calm under pressure. A crack in the mast didn't bring panic, brought tools, men, and focus. A leak in the hull meant moss and tar at dawn. Broken rope meant splicing before night. The sea forced repair, and repair forced survival. That is how voyages kept going. One repair after another. A mast lashed back into place. A hull seam sealed. A rope spliced. And the ship, wounded but alive, sailed on. Life aboard a Viking ship demanded teamwork. There was no room for lone heroes. Each task united men in a shared rhythm: row together, haul rope together, fix leaks together. The ship was too small to support solo efforts. Success depended on many hands working as one. When rowing, every man needed to pull in sync. One person out of step threw the balance off. Waves would roll the ship. Oars could clash. Rowers risked falling in. You learned to watch your neighbor, keep pace, match breath. It was quiet, only the splash of oars and the captain's soft call to change stroke. When one person stopped, all slowed. When they worked together, the ship sped forward. But cooperation brought tension. Living shoulder to shoulder for days bred stress. Clothes soaked, cold seeped in, and fatigue clouded minds. Men stopped stepping lightly. A wrong word, a careless shove. Conflict simmered. The captain had to maintain calm. He spoke firmly, without force quick words that carried weight. Tighten now, listen, steady. He didn't have soldiers or chains. Authority was respect. His crew watched him. They followed because they needed to survive. If he spoke sharply, men obeyed. If he showed weakness, they questioned. Fatigue tested every man. After a storm or long hours of rowing, tempers flared. A man reached for a rope wrong and another cursed. A glance was enough. Steam rose from resentment. They didn't fight with fists, there was no room but arguments lit in whispers. A shared insult could fracture trust. Trust mattered. If a crewman doubted another's strength, he doubted the entire ship. What if that man failed at the oar? What if he slapped a wet rope wrong and let it slip? Everyone watched the weak, quietly, and they remembered. There were no punishments like flogging, no chains, just isolation at sea. To offend the captain was to risk a spot in the bilge, shunting the bucket for hours. To insult a fellow crewman invited silence and task overload. You found yourself hauling lines alone. You sat on a sea chest far from the cruise center. The cold felt deeper there. The wind harsher in those silent punishments. Men learned quickly. They saw the weight of loneliness. The ship had no walls, but it had invisible barriers. One could exist apart, but only in Job and in chill. Cooperation was not optional. Rowers had to respond when told. Sail handlers had to pull ropes fast when storms hit. Repair went on even when hands bled. If a man refused or fell, the crew would slow. That invited danger. A slow ship was a vulnerable ship. Discipline was woven into every moment. Daily routines: row, watch, work, bail water, rest. Cook stuck to a rhythm. Wake at dawn, eat, draw water. Row until noon. Lunch, work on deck. Row until evening. Dinner, repair and rest. Storm or calm, the routine held. It leveled chaos. It built muscle and trust. It built belief that the group could face anything. Yet, there was friction. Space was tight, shoulder to shoulder on benches, sleeping amid crates. Singing this morning's victory would irritate. Snoring grated nerves. Cramped surfaces invited touch. Sweat met salt water. Space became walls pushing in. Emotions festered. A man overheard complaining about his or partner's pace. His eyes narrowed. He stayed silent but watched. The next day, at a sudden wave, the pace faltered. The oars dropped. The wave caught them, a near capsize. The ship righted, but only barely. Blame passed behind closed brows. Still, they could not stop. The sea demanded men. The mission demanded them. One man fell ill. He couldn't row. The others redistributed. They rowed harder and longer. The sick man took his oar in 3-4 day shifts. No one rested more than the sick. They called it bleeding through illness. It was survival. Sometimes a man could no longer keep up. Hiss or slipped. His legs shook. He collapsed on deck. The crew looked on. They worked around him. If he recovered, they welcomed him back. If not, He was left behind when they reached land, or in small boat near shore left, until help came, not punishment, realism, every voyage. Tested morale. When storms battered them, men could thank the captain for saving them or curse him for pressing onward. They watched signs, clouds, waves. If the captain rode on through a storm, some wondered why. They whispered. They watched others whisper. That quiet built suspicion. Silence made loyalty fragile. It required unity to break the weight. A meal helped her. Boiled oat stew passed among 6 men. A shared barrel of fresh water on sighting land. A story remembered. A whispered hope of seeing home. Those small gifts restored trust, even for an hour. Crew morale was fluid. A sailing day under sun, steady wind, and shared effort lifted spirits. The ship moved evenly. Jokes returned. Laughter echoed. Men grew lighter. Hope felt near. But a day into a storm shattered that. Rain buffeted decks. Repairs paused. Hunger dulled minds. Sweat turned ice. Morale dropped. Men muttered in corners. They stomped water clear from boots. They paced the deck while others watched. They felt trapped. The captain looked for signs. He watched shoulders drop, eyes dull. He ordered extra rations. He called crews to check on each other. He led by doing. He fixed a line. He bailed water. His presence cemented cohesion. A crew works best when they know they follow a living example, not just commands, but even he could not stop exhaustion. Long stretches at sea tore at unity. Crew watchers blurred. Fights nearly broke out over chores. One man accused his partner of stealing scrap wood. The captain had to step in. He compelled both into double shifts. The man worked until dawn with the other. Their shared fatigue became shared respect. From conflict unity could grow. A cut treated together. A storm weathered side by side. Shared suffering and shared repairs distanced single identities. They became part of a larger whole. The ship itself became a partner, protecting them when they worked together, punishing them when they did not. Some crews, under stress, developed small rituals. A wave capsize followed by a chant. A line mended with hand and truth, not curse. A shared song in calm waters. These things did not break the discipline. They reinforced it. It gave softness to tension. A man without skill felt weak. A man without strength was burden. So they reminded each other. Row steady. Hand me the line. Fix it tight. Silence in the face of challenge was a fault. And they spoke the words. Discipline was not force. It was an unspoken agreement. Crewmen saw the cost of failure. The sea would not forgive. They obeyed because the alternative was sinking. They worked because their lives depended on it. They respected because respect kept them alive. When land appeared, after weeks, crews stood straighter. Each man had faced storms in their hearts. Each had seen limits in himself. Each had needed another's hand to keep going. They stepped onto shore not as individuals, but as parts of a greater force. Their discipline, built at sea under relentless conditions, remained. But so did the tensions they carried. They talked then. They traded jokes. They drank water like it was gold. They moved freely without planning. They slept without fear of waves. And yet, within them, the stress remained a memory of cramped cold, shifting tempers, and unity under duress. Because when they left again, they had to be ready. They had to row together, haul together, fix together, survive together. They had to do it again. The ship demanded it. The sea demanded it. And they knew Crew dynamics meant life. Discipline meant survival. A single wave broke the ship. Wood splintered. Men plunged into icy water. Among them was Torgils and about 30 others. They were heading south along Greenland's east coast when their ship sank under iceberg-shadowed skies. No sails, no shelter, just open, frozen land ahead. The group stumbled onto rough shore and made camp on driftwood. Torgils and his companions watched their situation settle in. No ship, no supplies, and no guarantee of rescue. They were strangers in a harsh, glacial wilderness. They began by salvaging what they could: barrels, planks, scraps of sail. Then they hunted. In the white quiet, they spotted seals hauling out on ice. Men crept close, spears ready, waiting for the animals to slide in the surf. They struck with force, then butchered the carcass on the spot. The meat was cold and stung lips, but it fed them. Seal blubber became fuel for fires and oil for lamps. They boiled stew in a battered pot. Some drank the broth to stay warm. They ate seal meat raw in thin slices, feeling the fat burn their mouths. It was nourishment. It was survival. They found driftwood and bone, used them to build crude shelters. They sewed hides around frames made from ship timbers. Those shelters saved them from wind and ice. A dozen huts rose near the beach. In one, Torgil's wife gave birth to a son during the first winter. The baby's cry echoed in the cold night, a bright sound against endless ice. They survived that winter, but disease struck. Men fell with fever. They vomited blood. Some developed sores that would not heal. 4 companions died, one by one. Beside him, another tried to dig a grave in frozen sand. The body froze entirely, but mounds were raised out in spring. Torgils climbed a mountain to scout for ice floes and signs of rescue ships. Across the fjords, he saw nothing but white cliffs. On the next night, servants from his group raided their camp. They stole the boat and leftover supplies, and fled south, leaving the newborn and his mother behind. The mother lay helpless in midwinter. The group found her later, already dead, but they found a miracle: the crying baby clinging to life. That sight shook Torgils. He wrapped the boy in furs, wrapped his arms around the child, and refused to leave. A few loyal men stayed. They repaired the stolen boat with skins, bones, and driftwood. It was small, crude, barely seaworthy. They loaded seal meat, oil, and hide sails. They set out toward the western settlement, over hundreds of miles of open ocean. Before that, they hunted again. They speared polar bears near sea ice. They trapped Arctic foxes. They collected eggs from seabird colonies. They dried meat in smoke huts. They boiled blubber and mixed it with seal oil to make calorie-dense soups. Isolation pressed in at night. No neighbors, no familiar faces, just wind and frost. They slept beside fires, wrapped in furs. They watched the baby boy suckle, Torgils carrying him inside his coat. The child survived on breast milk, which Torgils provided unusual for a man. But necessity overrode. Custom disease lingered. Wounds infected. Coughs brought fever, but time passed. The ice thawed. Torgils set sail in the skin boat with 2 companions and the child. They faced a 2-week journey across the unsettled coast. They pushed through fog and tide. They landed at the western settlement, hungry, ragged, but alive. Only 3 of the original 30 survived the 4-year ordeal: Torgils, his son, and one companion. They spoke little at first. Inside the settlement, they huddled in halls, drank broths, warmed their bones. The mother lay buried in the ice, unnamed, her child alive. Torgils could not tell the women when he left the baby at his breast whether his wife would return. He didn't know. These castaways faced more than shipwreck. They faced isolation, disease, betrayal, hunger, and the constant threat of death. They adapted. They hunted seals, bears, birds. They made shelters. They mended boats. They carried on. Other Viking survivors told simpler stories. They fell into rock outcrops. They drowned in storm-swamped boats. But Torgil's story stood out. He survived for years. He hunted his way south. He fathered a son in isolation. He brought that son to a thriving settlement where others waited. Disease came fast in those settlements. Leprosy, scurvy, tuberculosis, frostbite. In Greenland, sagas tell of outbreaks that killed half of settlers. Isolated groups had no doctors, no traders, no chance to import fresh produce. They relied on fish, meat, and gut-bloomed vegetables. When disease struck, the sick died quickly or lingered in pain. A simple wound could fester into gangrene. No antibiotic, no surgeon. A young hunter might return, missing a hand, his arm rotting, his life in pieces. That's if he saw land. Farther out, on ice floes, only death waited. Isolation meant nothing could be arranged quickly. No rescue, only time or luck. No one came looking for castaways. The sea was wide, the coast was empty. Torgils and his companions hunted self-reliantly. They tracked seal and whale. They trapped salmon in fjords. They dried fish on racks of driftwood dot. Then they repaired a stolen boat with hide sails. They navigated by stars, by currents, remembering routes from stories told years before. That knowledge saved him again. They reached farms, trading posts, and meat-filled tables. They stepped into community, but they carried ice in their breaths and sorrow in their bones. Survival in remote regions demanded more than rowing or sailing. It demanded adaptation, brutal decision-making, and fierce will. It demanded trusting a man who could butcher a seal, tend a newborn, and stitch a hide boat-all while frost crept into his marrow. When these men reached settlements, they were different. They held silence more often. They guarded scars, their bodies, their minds. They paused at gatherings when others spoke of glory. They remembered what starvation tasted like, what cold killed like, what disease stole like a shadow. Their survival shaped sagas, influenced names, carved warnings into history. They were living proof of human endurance in wild, frozen places. Their stories traveled far, far beyond ice. After days at sea, spotting land brings relief. It paints hope onto faces. For Viking sailors, the right shore meant everything. Fjord mouths, islands, rocky outcrops, they offered shelter. These small harbors were lifelines. Even if they were far from towns or trade routes, they meant wood, water, repairs, rest. Crews guided their boats close to shore, using small inlets and coves carved by rivers or glaciers. Waves broke less hard here. Currents softened. The ship could come to rest against rocks or mud. With luck, the shoreline offered fresh water in streams or wells. Men could refill their barrels and rinse salt off themselves and their sails. On rare islands, driftwood gathered like gold. Sailors hauled up logs to rebuild decks, patch holes, or shore up masts. Fresh timber made repairs stronger. Tar applied fresh could protect hull seams for weeks at sea. They hammered iron spikes into planks and tied new ropes. Crews split in two. Small teams, fix rope, fix wood, fix sails. They worked in silence or quiet chat, aware that calm days were precious. Food became real again. They fished with nets from shore. They gathered berries. Small goats, sheep, or cattle let them resupply with fresh meat or milk. Even eggs from seabirds were valuable. These quick meals gave them energy and revived morale. A pot of fresh stew, warm and nourishing, offered hope after long weeks of salted slabs and stale grain. Yet these places were not safe havens. Most offered no real protection from wind or waves. Fjords could funnel squalls. Islands could trap storms. Crews learned to listen for changes. A calm harbor at sunrise could roar by afternoon. Tide shifts might leave the ship grounded. A rocky inlet in high tide became a beach of wrecked boats in low water. Mooring was always uncertain. They dropped, anchors or tied to rocks, but tide and surge threatened to pull the boat free. Crews sent out small boats to stake it deeper. Others stood watch. If the anchor dragged, a night could end with the longship battered against cliffs or lodged on hidden shoals. On one voyage, a crew moored in a gravel barn near a small inlet. They slept deeply after a full day of chaining anchor and renewing ropes. A sudden tide shift pulled the chains slack. By morning, the ship had drifted half a mile, lodged on a reef. The hull planks had opened. Water poured in. It cost days of repair and extra rations. Some men grew weak. Their faces grew drawn, and rowing resumed under colder skies. Even sheltered harbors held danger from the shore. Sharp rocks and barnacles cut through leather boots and skin. Ramps created wounds. Cold water robbed warmth from wet feet. Often, the only place to draw water was from a shallow stream. These were home to insects in warm months, small bites that festered on cold, damp legs. Isolation here created its own terror. Men stepped on land and believed they were safe. But nights in makeshift shelters could bring wildlife, foxes, seals, even bears. A single cook's hut lit with coals might near become a beacon to curious animals. A seal might snatch food. A fox could steal water. A bear might trample nets. Fresh water carried hidden risks. Streams looked clear, but could flow through animal pastures. Crews boiled it, but early infections struck anyway. Diarrhea and fever stole strength fast. A simple hunger became a fight with illness. Strong men weakened in days. Harbors also offered respite in work ethic. They mossed boots, changed clothing, repaired woodwork, and painted tarp with tar for waterproofing. Sailors took time to loosen tight shoulders. They washed salt from their hair. Sunlight on their faces drew smiles. Laughter returned. Stories were told again. Some practiced drills, rowing alongside another ship, mooring when wind arrived fast. Each calm day became a training ground for survival. Trade sometimes happened. Islanders sold wool, butter, salted fish, or tools. A small boat came with traders. Men swapped metal fishhooks for cloth or beads, iron nails for cured cheese. These extras lightened their pack. A new rope or a length of chainmail fence made light sails or stronger rigs. But no trader was guaranteed. Most islands had no one at all. Some were uninhabited. Crews alone took everything they found. Driftwood, fresh water, birds' nests. Everyone left the area cleaner than they found it, less debris. They carried respect for land. Mooring occurred under watchful eyes. If the sky darkened, crews hurried to haul sail. If wind built, they tied lines tighter. No rest until every rope was secure. Lines around rocks, tied to cleats, anchored well. Each rope checked, each knot tested again. Twice their fingers felt rope burn under tension. Cold sweat on hands, flat palms, ropes gnawed at skins. Stepping ashore meant risk of leaving ship. Storm could begin before anyone returned. Men took watches, walking along the shore to listen for swells. A steady swell wasn't dangerous. A sudden one, caused by storm miles away, was deadly. Hidden swell crept into fjords with no warning. Crews trained to feel ground not sound or sight. When they finally left, men rowed away slowly at first. They checked the chain and lines. They watched behind at the rope snaked back to the land. If it pulled free, they went back. If it held, they summoned sails. They left land behind, feeling the rhythm return oars in water, ropes creaking, smell of salt on the wet sail. But some left earlier than they should have. A fresh east wind drove rain and brought frost. Boats that stayed became buried in mud. Some sank under added weight as mud piled on board. Rocks shifted under the hull. Storms arrived without thunder or lightning. The crew found themselves at sea again in worse condition than before. In these harbors, Viking sailors learned hard truths. The sea was still near. The land offered help but no guarantee. They knew how to fix their ship, feed their stomachs, trade for tools. They learned patience. They watched weather. They learned how to wait without rest. Their survival depended on this. A misstep meant they drowned just beyond shelter, under a grey Norse sky, and when the ship finally slipped away from shore, men breathed differently. They carried fresh water and fresh hope, but they also carried scars of rope burn, a cut foot, a sense that the land did not protect. They knew to thank the fjord for shelter, not to expect friendship. They learned to respect boundaries harbors that saved them, but also exposed them. They learned to leave fast when survival moved on. Viking life at home could be tight. Land was precious and limited. Many farmers barely scraped a living from small plots. Field borders met chisel-worn shores and dense forest. New families struggled to build homes. Taxes, tithes, and tributes ate up grain and livestock. Sending one son on a voyage freed resources. It opened space at home and opportunity for those who left. The culture of exploration grew from this need. It wasn't reckless adventure, it was necessity. Journeys meant potential, land, wealth, status. A chieftain who claimed lands provided for his people. He won loyalty and tribute. A young man who returned with goods from abroad, amber, walrus ivory, furs, could rise in rank or even challenge older leaders. It wasn't just trading, it was gaining honor. The chieftain called men to join expeditions. Every able-bodied man was expected to carry an oar, haul a rope, fight if needed. Refusing was shameful. It suggested cowardice, or worse, a lack of loyalty. Those who stayed risked being mocked or worse, labeled a coward's son. The kin felt the pressure firsthand. Leaving on a longship wasn't optional if your father was a chieftain's retainer. It was your duty. Rarely did the men volunteer just for glory. It was duty. Chieftains spoke of revenge raids, trading voyages, and land claims. They promised new life to anyone who left, a share of the catch, a home abroad, a story worthy of retelling. Men believed it. But the journeys offered another promise too: escape. Escape from taxes, gossip, poor marriage prospects. small plots that wouldn't feed a growing family. Pride fueled them forward once at sea. Each wave they beat with an oar was a tribute to lineage. They wore their status on carved shields. Their leader's name was whispered in the rigging. Every knot tied with care reminded them of their honor. But their hearts carried dread too. They knew the cold, the hunger, the storms waiting ahead. They knew what the sea demanded, and yet they rowed on. The sagas speak of Harald Fairhair's Viking bands, the men who left behind frostbitten farms to fight overseas. Yet these same men crossed icy waters at endless oar. They clutched their chieftain's banner even when their fingers froze. They sang their leader's name in chants meant to drown fear. And when a man fell from his seat or dropped his oar, others caught it. Others rowed harder. Exploring meant brutal conditions. Crewmen knelt at wet decks, wrapped in cold cloaks that never dried. The northern wind ripped their beards. Sail stitching cut their hands. Each day pushed them deeper into discomfort. They dealt with frostbite, starvation, and disease. These weren't romantic tales. These were living tests of worth. Pride turned necessity into ritual. Leaving home with provisions was like carrying the family's name to the sea. Each oar stroke honored the farm, the family, the line that raised them. Each attempt at farming they failed to do alone was now a communal push. They took responsibility for those at home who stayed behind. Sometimes it faltered. Creaking ships, broken masts, storms that forced retreat. The chieftain's face fell. The crew's silence whispered fear. Pride could not save a sinking wooden hull, but pride kept them going. They patched ropes. They soaked sails. They spied land again, silently hoping for better. Success meant more than the journey. It meant coming home with goods. Walrus tusks and pelts became status symbols. Silver from trade weighed down chests. A returned chieftain could now conquer land or win marriage alliances. Sons named after him gained respect. Songs were written about the voyage. Men whose names survived through runes stood proud. Failure meant shame. If a man returned empty-handed or not at all, shame followed home. Families whispered curses. He had no courage. Or worse, the chieftain's wrath fell on his household for not supporting his men. Honor wasn't just personal, it was contagious. It spread through families and clans. Pride competed with brutal reality. A recovered pride in sand-filled halls of home could outweigh fear at sea. Men learned to endure chaos as long as the story lasted. How they tattooed the mast with valor. How they saved a comrade with one hand around a rope. How they rode through nights longer than day. Pride shaped perseverance. Social expectations weighed heavy. If a mother's son didn't leave, what kind of man would he be? A weak man, a lesser man. His bride's father questioned him. His peers mocked him. In many stories, sons followed. Fathers into voyagers. A lineage of sailors. A brother's shame had to be washed away by another's courage. The collective pride of a family forced them to face ice and storm. One saga tells of a man exiled to Iceland for slaying a neighbor. He arrived with nothing. He sent east again, searching coasts in a fragile skin boat, hoping to find more land. He did. In Greenland he built a homestead. His return home, empty, would mean failure. But ownership of new land turned his exile into triumph. Cultural pressure formed his return. But not every traveler came home. Some vanished in the North Atlantic. Some starved in freezing camps. Relics show skeletons on remote isles, single graves. Bodies turned to dust. Their names were forgotten. Their journeys never praised. But their families kept the stories. A gravestone carved with runes on an empty island told of a son who never returned. That story shaped his surviving kin. They added land, gold, marriage. They honored his absence. Pride kept men rowing through fog. It kept them tightening ropes through rain. It made them ignore the cold until bones ached. It demanded progress when ships cracked, even when mending ropes, rebuilding shelters. Hunting seals demanded more strength than rowing itself. Pride demanded it. It stitched them together as a team. Often, that pride was their undoing. A storm hit a half-repaired mast. They refused to turn back. They stayed off rocks an hour too long. The boat struck. A hull cracked. A man drowned. Pride pushed them too. Far they realized too late that the sea didn't care about ambition. Yet cultural pressure said they must sail again. Sons of veterans looked to their fathers. Daughters wove cloth, thanking Odin for safe voyaging. The next generation was ready. Same names, same claims. Pressure repeated itself. The sea didn't know farms were small. The cold didn't care about honor, but the men felt it all. Their bodies were battered, their minds flagged, and still they rowed because pride asked them to. In this way, cultural pressure was both fuel and weight. It drove voyages across open Atlantic. It drove settlements across islands and Greenland. It drove men into the unknown. But it also drove them into storms, into shipwrecks, into hunger. The same force that pushed them forward also stared back at them when they drowned or froze. Men were caught in a story older than themselves, of honor, of lineage, of farming fathers and roaring sons. That story lived in their chests and guided, their hands on the oar. They owed it to those who stayed behind, and to those who died along the way. They set sail into the North Atlantic, their only guide an endless horizon. Icebergs loomed ahead, silent giants drifting from glaciers far north. Some stood hundreds of feet tall, walls of ice that glowed pale blue. The longship passed close enough to feel the chill. Cold spray hit the crew, and the deck turned slippery. They leaned into their oars, muscles tight, eyes locked ahead. One wrong move, and they could crash into ice that gouged would right through the hull. Far from land, they felt small. The ocean stretched forever. Below, whales broke the surface, enormous backs glistening in the sun. These whales were both a wonder and a threat. When one surfaced too close, it could capsize a small boat. Their tales passed into legend. One saga tells of a whale with human-like eyes guiding a lost sailor to safety. Another calls them evil giants conjured by witches. Still, the men watched them in awe and fear, never sure if the whales were friend or foe. They crossed hundreds of miles of open sea. The weather changed without warning. Bright mornings turned cloudy. Calm seas swelled into waves that smashed against timbers. Sailors could hear seashell-sized hail clattering on the deck. Rain drove in sheets, followed by sleet that froze instantly. They could row one moment and reef the sail the next. One man yelled ice, not far from the ship. They hove to, shifting oars, their hearts pounding. They passed along whispers of the iceberg's size. No one spoke loud. No one laughed. Crews had to balance risk and progress. Keep westward or return to Greenland. Summer sailing eased weather, but iceberg fields stretched south of Greenland shore. In some years, Pack ice blocked their way for miles. They followed currents and wind patterns recorded in memory. Ice drifted with the Labrador Current. The sagas suggest summer temperature near Newfoundland was about 16 degrees Celsius, warmer than Greenland but cool for beans. They named islands as they passed. Helluland, Stony Land, marked by slabs of rock. Markland, Forestland, where they saw tall trees and foxes. One voyage found hop, a wide river mouth, plenty of fish, wild wheat, even grapes. Here they landed and stayed, building shelters and hunting food. Wildlife greeted them in Vinland. Elk and deer wandered in forests. Seabirds nested in cliffs. Puffins, gannets, gulls food and guide to land. One group found a beached whale's blubber and meat a feast. But those behind the whale's death fell ill after eating it, so they dumped the rest over a cliff. Bears lurked nearby. One story tells of Carl Sifney's crew encountering large bears near the settlement. They hunted seals and whales at sea. Foxes and rabbits were caught inland with traps. They gathered berries and wild wheat. Men planted small patches of grain. The sagas describe wild grapes growing in sunny slopes of Vinland. Weather remained unpredictable. Storms rolled or squalls came. Fast, one moment calm, then wind screamed. Sail changed angles. Oars were pulled in, then thrust back. Rain washed off salt until everything smelled of fish and earth. They faced fog and haze. Land appeared briefly, then disappeared. Currents caused mist to rise from cold water onto warm air. Sailors hunched over the rail, trying to pick out tree lines. Some said they sailed for days, believing they were heading south, only to find themselves near the same island. They had to trust their mental maps. Currents and wind shaped their journey. The Labrador Current ran south. The Gulf Stream turned east toward Europe. They chose paths that gave them favorable pushes. The sagas hint sailors used these currents without knowing their names. Encounters with whales reinforced their humility. They heard whales sing underwater. The song came across the hollow hum that made them shiver. Some believed it was a warning, others thought it was guidance. Either way, they paid attention. In the open sea, there was no rest. Watch shifts were tight and cold. Rowers took over, even if only to keep the hull stable. Storms made sleep impossible. Tents were tied down, fires extinguished. Men huddled together, wrapped in wet cloaks. They spoke less. They bit salted meat in silence. Landfall brought relief. The forests smelled like food and home. They ran up the beach, shaking off cold. They dropped planks to build huts. They cut wood. They cooked. They took first steps inland and found berries, game, fish. They drank fresh water that tasted sweet after the salty ocean. Women and children occasionally came on later voyages. Pregnant Gudrid gave birth to a son. He became the first European born in North America. They named him Snorri. His birth was a sign Vinland could be home. But land didn't mean peace. Indigenous people called Skrilling Gurkame in hide canoes. Some traded for cloth, hides, milk. Others fought back. Shields clashed. A bull charged at canoes. Skirmishes drove them. Apart, the Norse realized this land wasn't free of conflict. They stayed for months, unaware their settlement was fragile. Weather turned, winter approached. They feared being frozen out. Currents shifted. Storms battered the shore. Their ships creaked. They had to choose stay and risk death, or leave with hopes of return. So they left. Ship hulls creaked with wood, stored whale meat, and their newborn son. They steered past icebergs, past whales, past islands named Helioland and Markland. They took home stories of wild grapes, forests, and a land richer than any they had known, but also full of danger. They crossed the Atlantic again, guiding their fragile boats with memory and hope, not metals or charts. Icebergs met them in the fog, whales surfaced beside them. Storms challenged their seamanship. But they pressed on, driven by memories of Vinland's promisand, by fear of losing the way home. Stories of Vikings focus on raiders with axes, shields, and berserker fury. But the real challenge wasn't in battle. It was in sea and skill. Sailing was the ultimate test, far harder than raiding a coastal village. Longships were design marvels light, flexible, fast but built of wood and leather. Waves bent their hulls, winds strained their sails. Every voyage pushed men to their limit. Crews had to fix the ship, navigate by sun and stars, and survive storms. Battle was swift. The sea dragged on. Norse sagas are honest about this. They tell of froze fingers, hunger near sinking, and weeks of fog at sea. They don't glamorize heroism. They lean into challenge. In Ikram the Red, Leif's voyages hinge on weather, currents, and crew. Exhaustion only. A few men survive too. Share the tale? Sagas tell us it was luck, skill, and stubbornness that brought them home. Reddit.com, Reddit.com +1 military, Saga.com +1. Even raiding sagas show respect for seamanship. A swift ship saved lives. A skilled navigator allowed surprise landings. A broken mast could end a mission. A storm could swamp an entire fleet. Vikings spoke of sea with reverence and fear. Crossing to Vinland was not seen as a grand adventure. It was a careful, fearful step beyond known waters. The sea tested every man. It tested the ship. It tested the captain's memory and judgment. The sagas spoke of half-villa state of confusion at sea. Men forgot landmarks, lost sense of direction, drifted off course. That confusion weighed heavier than enemy shields. Medium.com, when storms hit, sagas describe the deck's chaos, towering waves, groaning timbers, soaked oarsmen clinging to ropes. In those moments, there was no glory, only survival. Sagas, like Noal's saga, don't praise valor with axes at sea. They show fear in faces and frost in beards, realism over romance. Raiders were craftsmen, farmers, fishermen, traders. Most men spent more time tilling fields or hauling nets than hacking shields. Being a Viking was a roller season or two of sea danger, not a way of life. That's why sagas focus on voyages and negotiations, not endless slaughter. Reddit.com +14 travels. Helper.com +14 Reddit. Kong Quatriven. Stories of raiding clasp a boot to realism. They mention Sice closing off harbors in early winter. They mention ropes snapping in storms. Crews turning back with half their ship broken. Not every raid ended in gold. Some ended in drowned men and empty sails. The sagas record both. They don't hide those failures. One saga describes Karl Sifny's expedition to Vinland. It mentions harsh coastlines, sickness, and tension among crew, not glamour. They traded with indigenous people but retreated after conflict. They didn't celebrate conquest overseas. They returned, weary, and their saga records that fatigue. A lesser-known episode tells of Auden, a poor Icelander who carried a polar bear as gift to the King of Denmark. That journey required diplomacy, patience, and hardship on sea. The saga emphasizes bargaining, waiting for wind, and risk on deck, not a single battle. His honor was measured by endurance, not blades. N.Wikipedia, org, Satokidson, WS+1. N.Wikipedia.org. We even see myth creeping in later, in descriptions of sea creatures and divine storms. But sagas still ground themselves in ship logs, oars lost, men lost, food spoiled. They speak of sea mist hiding cliffs. They speak of cracked hulls patched on the wave. They speak of mast failure and jury rigging. They speak of voyages through exhaustion. They speak of leaning on one another to survive. Vikings believed in fate and gods, but sagas show gods did not guarantee victory. They gambled on Neptune, but also measured tides. They prayed to Thor, but stored spare rope. They carved runes, seeking protection, but also tested sails in calm harbors. This is realism tempered by belief. To modern audiences, sagas may seem romantic, but if you look, they speak truth. Stories of glory are rare. Stories of hardship are everywhere. A man returns home dirty, with frozen feet, telling simple tales of hunger and storm. That is the Viking who sailed farther than anyone else, without modern tools, without guarantee. When the sagas mentioned battles, they often started with weather warnings. A raid set sail after calm dawn. Men were alert for wind. Drake clouds overhead, they paused. Rain could delay landing. Raiding was seasonal. Too early, and torrents would drown villages. Too late, and ice would trap them. Vikings didn't charge in blindly. They charted seasons, judged winds, watched swell patterns. They kept logs in memory. 12 days from this island to that shoal, they tracked currents. A man could be remembered not for his sword, but for his skill at calculating sun shadow. Sagas mention such men, pilots, navigators, at least as much as warriors. Icebergs strewn, seas to Vinland, tested them again. Sagas tell of whales smashing against the hull in darkness. They tell of pack ice forcing rerouting. They speak of iceberg fields at night shining pale under moonlight, and men rowing under tension. No horned helmets here, just deck splinters and frozen eyelashes when Vinland was reached. Sagas mention wild grapes and game, but also storms that nearly destroyed camp, shortages of food, and crew members longing for home. Those stories aren't glamour, they're caution and endurance. The myth of Vikings as unstoppable raiders misses the real struggle at sea. The real Vikings were skilled sailors, brilliant navigators, cautious planners, and above all, survivors. Their greatest battles were not fought with axes, but with wind and water and the fear deep in their chests. Their legends live on, but the truth is darker. It is carved into ship timbers, salted into fish, whispered in sagas with trembling voice. It is the story of men who paddled beyond the known, learned too late what lay beyond, and still chose to try again. That is the Viking reality, harsh, humble, and human. From the moment a boy could hold an oar, he learned the sea. Fathers pointed out landmarks from deck. Mothers told stories of storms. These stories were lessons disguised as tales. A boy would learn which current pushed east and which cloud meant rain. A girl might learn the names of birds that led toward land. Knowledge passed from one generation to the next, held as tightly as an oar. That unspoken knowledge was more than tradition, was survival, No one wrote sailing manuals. Maps were memory. Techniques were verbal and practical. On the beach, a fleet would wait until elders taught how the tide worked in that bay. They measured the shadows of oars at noon. A slight dip in the sun indicated the far north. These measurements were learned through repetition. Sundials were basic, just a wooden stick in soft wood or sand. But they marked noon. When the sun passed noon, the ship's heading was checked. Navigators watched the sun's angle at midday to stay on latitude. On long trips they knew that a shift of just a few degrees could push them into open ocean. Or safety. A sunstone might have been used. Norse legend referenced a crystal that could reveal the sun's location in murky skies. Experiments with Iceland's spar show it can polarize light and point to the sun's position even in haze. Not a miracle, just sharp observation turned into useful tool. Experienced sailors trained to read light by testing sunstone. They felt texture in light. They felt the sea and watched the sky pattern and reflection, and they could guess the sun's position. Night navigation depended on stars. Polaris guided northerly seas. Orion's belt might mark the path westward. Young navigators learned star patterns like modern scouts learn constellations. It was practical knowledge. Knowing the sky could save a crew lost in fog, learning it. Sea was constant. Men rowed by day. At night they practiced by naming stars. One hand on an oar, one eye on the sky. Memory came alive. Someone would call out their 3 stars above yonder mast, and the navigator would confirm, that is Polaris, 20 degrees above horizon. We are on track. Mentorship thrived. An elder sailor never left the younger to fail. A misread cloud pattern meant the master would call out a warning. A wrong sound in the water meant slower rowing. Together they hunted whales and seals, handled sails, and plugged leaks. Experience was sunshine over cold deck. It warmed the crew's confidence, or technique was shared. Rowing long hours meant learning from hands that came before you, how to lean weight, how to brace feet, how to grip without burning, how to breathe in rhythm. All these details were visible and taught silently. Every motion became shared history. The same was true of navigation. When a journey followed a coast, a skipper would repeat last summer's route. We left that cove on the 3rd day after the first quarter moon, he'd say. Boats marked rocks, carved runes, or painted stones memory anchors. The next season, new men saw them and understood, this is the place we passed. This is what the tide does here. They drilled this story until it became as real as the keel. But voyages were not just practical school. They built character. Men returned with more than calloused hands. They carried stories. Stories of near misses, of whales that brushed the hull, of snow and hunger. Those stories became schooling. A man who heard his father's voyage as a child carried the lesson in his arms. Knowledge transfer went beyond sailing. On remote islands, men needed to hunt seals, fish, trout, collect shellfish. They learned which nets worked on different currents, how to butcher whale blubber, how to cure skins without rotting. They created smoke huts. They learned safe plants for medicine. They feared elder knowledge. One bloated root might kill you, another cure you. That distinction came in stories. Fire in the stern oar, under a cover for a cooked tot seasoning. By feel, a flaky, darkened pot showed too much heat. A dull boil meant not enough. When a salted fish hardened under too high a flame, men remembered it. Next time they lowered the fire. They passed that lesson to those behind. Even simple tasks had meaning. Hauling the anchor at night required knotting skills taught by old left-handers. To loose a knot, and the boat drifted. Too tight, and releasing would break thwarts. A proper knot meant sleep, calm, safety. Taught hand to hand, silently, until the muscle knew. Discipline grew from learning together. Mistakes were corrected without insult. A young boat handler who missteered did not face wrath. He faced guidance. Too much port. Eyes up. He practiced under calm skies before storms. That respect for learning kept morale high. The greatest lessons came in storms. When seas roared, the old and the new held ropes together. A young man at the helm learned instantly when a fellow rower called hold forward. The boat balanced. It saved lives. That moment cemented a bond no home school ever could dot. These bonds mattered most in crisis. A broken mast at sea left no space for blame. Everyone had a role. The carpenter shaped a stave. The cook handed nails. The navigator steadied the hull. Their shared knowledge turned panic into teamwork. Each man believed the others had seen this break before. Confidence grew from knowing someone else's hands had held this plank, tightened this rope, climbed the mast. Knowledge transfer also built resilience. When they landed in Vinland, they had to learn local wildlife, soil, weather. They adapted, quickly planting small grain patches, building smokehouses, setting traps. Their success was not instinct. It was adaptation of shared skills. Fishermen learned to teach others where trout swam. Hunters showed how to trap rabbits with snares. They taught women and children, too. The boy or girl of 8 watched an elder set a net in a stream. They learned the wader's depth, the current direction, a shift, a fish strike. Those became lessons for the future. When disease struck, old women used herbal poultices passed down through generations. They recognized berry broths that could ward off scurvy. They recognized fungi and weeds that could ease fever. The knowledge survived in chants and rhymes. Mint and yarrow staunched the bleed. That voice could mean life or death. Young men learned in the ship's hold. Wounded hands strapped with spruce resin. Blisters dried with tar cloth. These first aid measures were old ways passed mouth to ear. They saved the crew. Survival skills connected crew, families, and homeland. A navigator's child listened to map songs and knew weather patterns by age 10. A child who drew a ship's line in sand carried home a dream. That child's future was shaped by the voyage's survival rhythm. These skills built entire communities. In Greenland, they planted barley. They fished through ice holes. They built barns. Men passed these skills to their next children. They became farmers, fishermen, shipwrights, all because they sailed and returned. They shared their knowledge in runes, stones carved with landmarks, stones telling this story, here by the river. 12 stones west, that acted as a school for future sailors. A map without ink, but living memory carved in rock-dotted sea. They passed stories to. A man named Olaf carried a tale of a ship he joined in youth maimed by storm, repaired at sea, saved by skill. That story lived in him. As a man, he told it to his son. His son believed in skill. His son became a navigator, so the skill passed again. In their culture, knowledge never stayed private. It belonged to the group. A navigator did not lock his methods. He taught them. He kept silent only on secret currents. Most of all, he taught the oarsman and the deckhand how to survive. They passed that onward. Strong bonds formed from this sharing. The crew became family. They trusted each other's hands. They believed each other's knowledge. That trust was life. It meant when the mast snapped, they dropped their rows to tie the mast together. Their hands fit as one, their wills fit as one. Sailing across thousands of miles, through ice and hordes of fish, storms and fog, lacked brilliance. It required brains shaped by knowledge, shaped by a chain of teachers reaching back generations, and sons and daughters who held onto that chain, not just for adventure, but because it was their way of life. Now you know what it truly meant to sail with the Vikings. The biting cold wasn't just discomfort, it was constant danger. The winds screamed across the open sea, and the icy spray soaked everything. Sailors rarely had dry clothes. Their skin cracked, their fingers numbed. Sometimes they couldn't even feel their own hands. The storms came without warning. Giant waves crashed over the sides of their longships. Masts broke, ropes snapped. A moment's mistake could send the whole crew into the sea, and they were far from land. There was no help waiting nearby, only water, sky, and more water. Food ran low, fresh water, spoiled, salted fish and dried meat kept them going, but only just. Starvation was real. Some voyagers turned back, others pressed on, even as their bodies weakened. When the food ran out, survival meant hunting seals or fishing with bare hands. Sometimes, even that wasn't enough. But the strain wasn't just physical, it was mental. Endless rowing, long dark nights, isolation, fear, and silence. The ocean gave no comfort, yet they kept going. Why? Because their ships were brilliant. In design, shallow enough for rivers, strong enough for the sea. Because their skills were unmatched: navigation by stars, repair in storms, hunting in the wild. And because they trusted each other, they trained together. They survived together. That bond made the difference. They didn't just cross the seas, they endured them. They reached new lands, returned with stories, and passed down knowledge that shaped generations. Their journey was not just about travel, it was about survival, identity, and a sacred duty to the ancestors who taught them how to endure. For the Vikings, the sea was not a place of escape. It was a proving ground, a rite of passage, a trial by nature that forged bonds deeper than blood. You could not fake your strength on the open water. You either proved your worth, or the sea took you. Even children grew up with this legacy. From a young age, they listened to tales by firelight, stories of distant lands, monstrous storms, and heroic deeds. These weren't just bedtime stories. They were lessons, warnings, blueprints for survival. They learned to tie knots before they could write. They learned to read the stars before they knew the shape of their own homeland. The sea was their school, and every wave taught them something. When they weren't sailing, they prepared. Boats were built by hand, each plank carved and curved with care. Tools passed down from father to son. Women played their part, weaving sails from wool, preparing food stores, and keeping the hearth alive. Everyone had a role. No detail was too small. Because on the sea, anything overlooked could lead to death. And when they made landfall, they carried that same discipline. Whether raiding or trading, settling or scouting, they moved with purpose. The same trust that held them together on the ship followed them onto new shores. That's why Viking settlements thrived, even in hostile lands. They were not just conquerors, they were builders, farmers, explorers, and storytellers. Those who stayed behind at home waited anxiously, scanning the horizon for returning sails. Every return was a celebration, a reunion, a continuation of the story, a sign that once again, knowledge and courage had won against the chaos of the sea. New maps were drawn, songs were composed, children gathered to hear what had been discovered. The past became present. The cycle continued. So when we speak of Viking voyages, we speak not only of bravery or battle, but of community, heritage, and the unbreakable thread of memory. Each ship that set sail carried not just men and weapons, but generations of wisdom whispered through the winds, etched into wood, alive in the heartbeat of the sea. We tell these stories now, not just to remember their hardship, but to admire their strength. The sea was cruel, but their courage was greater. If you found this journey through Viking hardship compelling, please give this video a like. It helps more people find stories like this. And if you'd like to join us again for more calm, immersive history, consider subscribing to our channel, Restless Historian. We'll be here every week, sailing into the past. Good night, sleep well,